So good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining this webinar, which is jointly provided by Clore Leadership and Counterculture. Clore Leadership is a resource for leaders and leadership in the cultural and creative industries, and Counterculture is an award-winning legal partnership that helps cultural, educational and creative organisations to plan, manage and thrive. So we're really delighted that so far over 60 of you have joined us this afternoon. And scanning the lists, we had over 80 register. We know that we have a variety of art forms of different disciplines from the cultural sector. We've got organisations of different sizes and scale, and we've got a really good geographical spread. So I'm quite confident that we're going to be picking up on the issues that are concerning the cultural sector vis-a-vis furloughing. Now, considering furloughing, what it is and how to do it well, is something that we know is really high on the agenda for every cultural organisation. We're all keen to do our best for the organisations that we're working with and for our staff. But we're not really sure what best looks like, because the guidance is still being written. There aren't any case studies that we can draw or compare our own particular organisations. And we're just really not sure, I think, that the government guidelines, how to apply them to the way that we work in the cultural sector. So how do we fit? How do the issues that we're grappling with specifically work vis-a-vis this new initiative? There's so much that's unknown, but we do know the value of dialogue. We know the value of cooperating, and that's one of the reasons why I'm really delighted that Counterculture are able to join with us to try and offer what we can know, what we can do, and offer that as a way of supporting colleagues in the cultural sector at this critical time. Just a quick word about how the seminar is going to work. You're going to shortly be hearing from the team at Counterculture, and Keith Arrowsmith, who's our governance associate at Clore Leadership, will introduce them. Your microphones are muted so that we can manage the process as smoothly as possible. And what we're encouraging you to do is to use the Q&A function to record your questions. We've had some that have been posted in already, thank you. But use the Q&A function, and we will then be able to pick up questions. The Q&A function is different from the chat function, which I can see many of you are also using. And we're keen that you use the chat function to share messages across the webinar group as a whole. But also, if you've come across any interesting resources or useful resources that you think, again, in that spirit of cooperation, you might share with others, please do post them there. Counterculture are going to download a list of resources that they've used in pulling together this webinar, and we'll share that with you afterwards as well. Just to say, we are recording just the first element of this webinar, the presentations, because we know that there are loads of others who are not available to attend now, but who would be very much interested in the information. So, without further ado, I'm really delighted to introduce our Governance Associate, Keith Arrowsmith from Counterculture. Keith, over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's great that Clore Leadership's been able to bring us all together, if only for an hour, to share our thoughts and experiences on what is really a most pragmatic but really timely subject. Hilary, Hills, Freya, Nadia, thank you for making all the arrangements. Who'd have thought? Even a few weeks ago, we'd all be online discussing a government grant scheme in quite these circumstances. Well, that said, I truly miss not being with you in person. But here we go, here's the next best thing. And may I electronically introduce you to my colleagues, Bo, who's our HR specialist, and Kathryn, who's our employment lawyer. And I'm Counterculture's charity law and governance lead. And together, we're going to present three slightly different views on what the coronavirus job retention scheme means. And we're sharing this presentation hoping to focus on latest updates and the most pressing concerns for the sector. Use the Q&A function. We're going to go through some slides, but I'm sure we'll really welcome your feedback to know what's on top of your lists. But for all we know, by the time we've finished the presentation, there may have been 3 new announcements. So let's keep checking to make sure that we can all keep up to date And if you need more than this general guidance, then please do speak to a specialist or get some legal advice to help. So what's it all about? I'm just going to help by sharing my screen, and hopefully we'll all be able to see the same thing. Here we go. I need to go there. There we go. Right. So the scheme, it's a temporary scheme, which looks like it's going to handle 3 times the value of applicants than they first thought. It's been designed in a hurry, and it's a bit rough and ready, but it should provide grant funding to UK organisations that have been severely affected by COVID-19. It's meant to help you retain your workforce and to protect the UK economy. It's not an economic safety net for every individual who's working in the UK. There is other limited help, but that's not going to help if you're not going to be involved in operating a PAYE scheme. And that's our focus for today. So if it works, it should help you avoid redundancies over the next few weeks. However, it's a scheme that's not going to run forever, and potentially it's not going to stop you drawing down on reserves. So we've got to be really careful about the scheme and making sure it's the right thing for you to do today. It's also going to be interesting when we do have to talk around other alternative situations, and if we get to the day where we do need to talk about redundancy. As some of you may know, if you've gone through redundancy processes before, you've got to, as part of that process, make sure that you consider all suitable alternatives to a redundancy situation. And certainly this scheme, the furlough scheme, might well be one of those other situations that ought to be considered before you move to redundancy. So I think we need to have a look at this scheme and those 2 concepts. One is it the right time to furlough someone? And secondly, is it a suitable alternative to a redundancy situation, which may at some point in the future be inevitable? Now, the second aspect of the scheme that's slightly odd is its relationship with other funding, and especially if you happen to be a public sector organisation or if you are funded by a public sector organisation. And there's going to be a tension between the furlough scheme and in effect being paid to make sure that someone doesn't work and receiving funds in order to make sure that a particular service or a particular project is delivered. And I think what we're going to be careful about is declaring to HMRC that someone isn't working, but yet declaring to funders that a project is being delivered. Now, as I said, the rules and regulations are a bit rough and ready, and we don't have any particular guidance from the revenue on where they're going to draw the line on this one. So there is a risk that at some point in the future that this is raised as part of the process of getting our funding back from the revenue. And we've got to be a little bit careful about making sure that there is one view that is being taken and the same approach is being taken by funders and by the revenue. So if in doubt, I think it's really, really important that we speak to those funders and see if we can come to a joint view on whether particular funding streams are to fund particular workers for particular projects. And if there is that close alignment, then making sure that particular part of the projects are delivered by those particular people on the terms and conditions of that grant funding. But if there isn't that close link, then I think there is grounds to make the claim under the furlough scheme and to carry on. But let's have those conversations first to make sure that we don't end up with any nasty surprises later on. So with that kind of context in place, let's just have a quick roundup of the terms of the scheme. We'll move on to how the scheme can be operated and making sure we can share that kind of best practice. And then I'll wrap up again at the end to make sure that we know where to go next. So, Kathryn, I think the first question we're going to have is around what do we mean by employees who can be furloughed under the scheme?
So the guidance on this is slightly broader than it might normally be for the definition of an employee. It is basically anyone who was on your PAYE payroll at the 28th of February, whether they're full-time, part-time, whether they're on 0 hours contracts. The guidance that was issued last week also clarifies that it applies to salaried, PAYE, office holders, workers, salaried LLP members, but it is that PAYE that's the key to it. The self-employed have a different scheme, as we've mentioned. So yeah, that's where this particular scheme is targeted.
And there was some debate around what would happen when people took early action, and either people were made redundant very early on before the scheme was announced, or if they perhaps left the organisation. Can you just talk to that?
Yeah, so if we're talking about reappointing leavers, the intention is that anyone who stopped working for you can be re-engaged and furloughed. The trouble is, anyone who stopped working for you is a really broad definition, and as you said, it's a scheme that's being developed as it goes. They have clarified that it will include people who are on fixed term contracts, for example, but only if those contracts would be renewed. So if they're on a fixed term contract, you can furlough them. You can extend their fixed term contract while they're on furlough. But if you wouldn't renew the fixed term contract, then you're not preserving that job. Certainly people whom you made redundant, whether they're on notice of redundancy or whether they've gone, it would be possible for you to re-engage those people and make a claim, put them on furlough and make a claim for their salary from that point. Leavers who chose to go, people who resigned and happened to leave, and they were going to another job in March and perhaps that other job has fallen through. The sense is that you could, if you felt it appropriate, re-engage those people and furlough them. There might be other difficulties associated with that. Have you recruited somebody else to that job? If they left for another reason, do you need to have that employee back? But it's not entirely clear as to how the guidance will apply, how the scheme will apply to those individuals, because they're not at risk of redundancy.
Sure, and that's going to be the overall test, to make sure that we're looking after the workforce rather than taking on people just for the sake of providing them with an economic. Yeah,
we think so. That's certainly where it started out. That it was at risk of redundancy. The guidance has changed slightly now. They're talking about if your business has been severely affected, and they are allowing you, for example, to furlough those who need to be on leave for childcare reasons, who might not actually have been at risk of redundancy. So that there are some sort of inconsistencies within the guidance at present, but.
And then we've got to keep an eye on the real value of the scheme, and actually why would the government set up a scheme like this and then severely restrict the people who are going to be benefiting from it? So I think there's a kind of general goodwill that sits behind the scheme that's going to be helpful for us on there.
Yes.
Just remind us again about the dates, because once we've got the people sorted out, the test is going to come back to some real key dates on who is able to apply.
Yeah, so the scheme at the moment runs from the 1st of March to the 31st of May. It may be extended, who knows? In terms of the backdating, it's backdating to employees who have been furloughed. Now again, you're going to have some issues. What happened if your employees took unpaid leave? What happens if employees were part-time? If some employees cut their hours down in March. So certainly for the part-time hours, it looks like you're not going to be able to make a backdated claim for that. If you've reduced employees' hours, you're going to have to pay them the reduced hours. But if employees have been furloughed very early on, as soon as it was announced, you will be able to backdate a claim as far back as the 1st of March.
Great. Okay, we'll keep coming back to some of those key points as we go into some more of the detail. But Bo, can you help us think through how that kind of process ought to work?
So when thinking about who should be furloughed, I think there's 3 key elements to this, and this would be around identifying the hardest hit parts of your business, how COVID-19 has affected your business. So you'd probably be looking at where the workload has reduced significantly or has decreased, just not there. Whether the organisation can afford to be paying salaries, and whether the work can also be undertaken by remaining staff or trustees, and also whether the staff that you're choosing to furlough, for example, those with childcare and shielding their family members, whether the home working isn't possible for them and therefore they are to be furloughed. But I would also say that it's very important to make sure you are furloughing and applying furlough in a consistent and in line with quality legislation, and so that there should be a fair and equitable rationale as to why you are furloughing, that you can explain to your organisation, the staff, and hopefully this will protect employers from the risk of discrimination claims in the future around the fairness. Why was I furloughed? Why did I still have to continue to work? Those sort of questions that might arise in the future.
Presumably there's the risk, at least, of some tension between some of the workforce being paid to sit at home and some other workforce having to take the brunt of the kind of the work that's left behind.
Yeah, there is that tension, and this is where we come back to being sure that you've applied it in a consistent way and that you've communicated to your staff why there's some staff that you are furloughing and some that you still need to be working, and that is quite clear.
And presumably because of that link with kind of potential redundancies, there may be more stringent rules around how formal that conversation needs to be.
That's correct. When we are usually changing, because this is a change to an employment contract, we would be obliged to go through some sort of consultation process. We still may have to go through that consultation process if we're dealing with some organisations that have trade unions in trade unions, that we need to agree how we're going to do the furloughing, what the terms of the furlough are. But the consultation could also take the direction of you're communicating with individual staff if you are not having to consult with a trade union on the terms and conditions.
Kathryn, is there a kind of limit to the size of a scheme where which triggers that kind of formal process?
Yeah, if you're intending to make variations to contracts of more than 20 employees, then the duty to consult with the underlying intention is that if they don't accept those variations, then you'll dismiss them for redundancy or whatever reason. Then that requirement will kick in, and the guidance does say that you will, all other employment law applies. So if the duty to consult arises, then they would expect to see employers doing that.
Right, okay. And I guess part of that conversation is about exploring the possible routes out of the current situation. So it might be a very simple, very light touch conversation about what the possible solutions might be, and it might quite gently shift further into something that's slightly more formal and controlled by that kind of regulatory approach.
Yeah, I think I would say if you are a large employer and you're going to be looking at making this, putting more than 20 employees on furlough, I would suggest that you you look at the consultation requirement and the level of consultation that will be expected of you. I mean, it's worth saying the TUC are backing the furlough scheme, so the chances of people seriously objecting, pragmatically what those risks are, it's impossible to say. But as you said, there's a sense of goodwill and preserving people's jobs, and that's the spirit of the scheme. But it is definitely something that larger employers need to consider, those collective consultation regs.
Okay, but regardless of size, Bo, what would you say would be the best way to kind of make sure that we're getting those messages across in the best possible way?
I think I think it's around being open and honest. It's about telling your staff, what you are doing and why and when. And also it's around doing it in I would say, that there's a tone to communicating with your staff. I mean, you're still wanting to maintain the trust and confidence, and just being very honest about what is happening here and what this scheme's about, really.
And once that conversations has started and a decision has been made to go ahead with the scheme, I think we're suggesting, certainly for best practice, if not, you've got to, under the scheme, produce some kind of formal written letter or way of spelling out exactly what's going to happen next. Yes,
that's right. You're going to have to produce what we're calling at the moment the furlough letter, but it is a change of a variation of contract, basically. So in that letter you should be spelling out, and you may well need to get some help around this, because it is a legal letter, and it will be around at how long you're furloughing that person for, also around what whilst they are being furloughed, how much of their salary they can expect to have. Are you paying 80%, or are you going to top the other 20% up? That sort of thing. What to do around annual leave, sickness. So this letter will be quite crucial to the terms and conditions around furloughing.
And Kathryn, if it is going to be a variation of contract, is there anything else we need to make sure is in place?
The general rules of contract law apply. If you're going to vary a contract, you either need a power within the contract to vary it, or the consent of both parties.
If we're going to issue a furlough letter, do we then need to make sure that we get some kind of confirmation back from the individual?
Absolutely. You've got to have consent from your employees to do this to them. This is a fundamental change. What you're saying to your employees is that we don't have any work for you, and we're going to reduce your salary by 20%. It's a major.
The button.
Yeah.
Do we have to reduce their salary by 20%?
No, you don't. The employer has the option to make up the extra 20%, but the scheme will only reimburse up to 80% of an employee's wages, capped at $2,500 for the month.
So we're sending a letter saying this is what we're intending to do, and then we're asking.
Do you consent? This is what we'd like to do. Do you agree? And they are going to need to agree to it, and that's true for any change, any significant change like this that you're wanting to make to the contract. We'll talk about annual leave and sick leave a bit later on, but
and so if the individual says yes, they agree to it, then they proceed to furlough.
Yes, then you would ideally get their consent in writing. You have to have evidence that you have written to your employee to confirm that they are on furlough. I would strongly recommend that you get the employee's consent in writing, confirmation that they have agreed to that change. And a lot of the templates that you'll see have a bit for the employee to sign. I accept this change to my terms and conditions.
And if they don't accept?
Well, You're talking about how you would vary a contract. Generally, it is possible for an employer to try to make a variation, and if those terms aren't accepted, to give notice. You might be saying, redundancies are on the cards. The general feeling is that most employees are likely to say yes, because the alternative is quite likely to be redundancy. It is important to note though that you've got to have actual consent. You shouldn't start this conversation by going, you must sign up to this or else. It's got to be willingly entered into. But pragmatically, how many employees will object is yet to be seen.
Sure. So what we're thinking about, how do we get a bit of flexibility into the scheme? And one of the things that's been suggested is perhaps sort of working with putting some people on furlough and then rotating the workforce. Is that okay?
Yeah, it's got to be. Furlough's got to be at least 3 weeks. So the minimum period that you can furlough someone is 3 weeks, and you can bring them back for a time and then furlough them again within that initial period of the scheme. And the suggestion that you could furlough lots of people for 3 weeks rather than one employee for the full 3 months is definitely something that would be possible. When you vary the contract, you're specific with each employee. You will be on furlough for this period, and then we'll have you back. I'd suggest a good furlough letter would give some framework as to how you will tell employees when you want them back as well.
Sure. And you mentioned 3 months there. Is that a maximum, or is that?
That's a reference to the period of time for which the scheme is open. At the moment, it runs from the 1st of March to the 31st of May.
But if we're furloughing people today,
no, yes. If you're furloughing people today, I would furlough them for a set period. We don't know that the scheme will run beyond the 31st of May.
Fine. So if we've gone through the process, we've issued the letter, we've had the consent back, then the staff are on furlough. Then Bo, how do you make sure you can keep that kind of interaction going?
Yeah.
Are we allowed to carry on having that kind of connection with staff?
Yeah, they're still your employees, so you still have an obligation to be in touch with them, basically, see how they're doing, and how often you keep in touch with them will depend on what you agree with them, really. And when you are keeping in touch with them, you might want to also provide them with business updates and furlough updates on what's happening now. So yes, you do want to keep connected with your staff.
Great, and I think it's slightly broader than that. It's also making sure that they're feeling safe and secure, and even if they are at arm's length of what's happening on a day-to-day basis.
That's right. I mean, although your staff will be furloughed, you still have the obligation of a duty of care towards them. And whilst I've heard that the furloughing, self-isolation may well be an introvert's paradise, some people quite like it. There'll be others in your workforce that do not like it at all, and they're extroverts and they like that contact. So how they deal with that being an issue. A lot of organisations, especially the bigger ones, have the EAP employment assistance programs, and I've seen some of them for the bigger organisations have an actual COVID-19 help there around your staff that might have underlying health issues as it is, or feel anxious, or if they're on 80% salary, then there might be some issues around whether that's going to cause some sort of debt. So there is the employee assistance programs that the bigger organisations have, but Failing that, the smaller ones that may not have set up an employment assistance programme, there is help on the .gov website for the public, which also has links into things like Deadline, the Samaritans, what sort of exercises you can do around if you're feeling anxious, which some of your staff may well be.
Sure.
But I would say do keep connected, keep talking to your staff, and let them know that you're available and you're there for them to explore any anxieties they might have.
But it is a part of the scheme, and it is a rule to say that they must not work. That's kind of one of the prerequisites.
Must not work. Yeah,
must not work. So Kathryn, if they can't work, what can they do? Are there aspects of things that might just be able to happen while they're on furlough?
You can volunteer, but not for your organisation.
Okay.
And you can work for others if your contract permits it. So these politicians who are returning to the NHS, whether that if you have an employee who wants to go off and work for somebody else, that's fine, so long as your contract with them doesn't say that you're required to devote all of your time and attention to us, kind of thing.
But there is a special requirement around training.
Yeah, so if you require your employees to undertake training while they're on furlough, that is permitted, with the proviso that any training that the employer is requiring them to do is classed as work. So you have to make sure that those employees are being paid national minimum wage for those hours. There has been a variation in terms of national minimum wage. So if you have people who are there or very close, because the scheme will only refund 80% of a wage. If you're on national minimum wage, that would mean that you're receiving less than national minimum wage for the hours in your contract. They've said that you're not actually working, so that's fine. But if you are training, then you are working, and you need to make sure that the training requirement that you're imposing on your employees doesn't mean that their working hours would mean that they were working for less than the minimum wage. It's only likely to be a risk if you've got a very extensive training requirement and you have employees who are very close to the relevant national minimum wage thresholds for their age.
Okay, so just to make sure I've got this right, if I'm a worker that's just sitting at home on furlough, and it's 80%, and I'm normally paid at minimum wage, that's fine. No one's going to criticise the employer paying it just under the minimum wage because of that furloughing 80%.
Yeah.
But if I'm going to actually spend my time training, then that's a different matter because I'm actually working, and that's got to be part and parcel of that. Righto.
Correct.
Thank you. We're going to move on to the quick fire round now, you two. So, annual leave, Kathryn.
You realise this is the one that's just not a quick fire round unless you go, this is really unclear, this part. The short answers are yes, annual leave is going to accrue. That seems to be accepted. ACAS is saying that you can take it. If you're on furlough, you can also take annual leave. Whether or not HMRC are going to take the same view hasn't been clarified. We don't know whether taking a holiday will break the furlough. And remember that you have to have at least a minimum period of furlough must be 3 weeks. So if your employee takes 3 days off in the middle, is that going to mean you can't claim for that 80% furlough? We don't know, unfortunately. And we also don't know, well, we do know if you take holiday that you're going to have to pay your employees their full rate of pay for the holiday, but we don't know what that's going to do to the claim that you make to HMRC. And there are lots of other complications about, particularly in the creative sector, quite a lot of organisations will only have the statutory minimum holiday allowance, which is 28 days, usually including bank holidays. If that's how your contracts are set up, then bank holidays designated holidays. So, and there are bank holidays coming up in May. So it's not very clear, and there are lots of people saying that it's not very clear. So I would hope that we'll get some improved guidance on that soon, as it's a bank holiday tomorrow.
Okay. And how about sick pay? Is that easier to come to a conclusion on?
Yeah, that's again, so employees can't be on sick pay and on furlough at the same time. If you have employees who are sick, they are entitled to statutory sick pay. If they are sick because they have COVID-19, or they are self-isolating because there's someone in their house that has COVID-19, they can also claim statutory sick pay. Bo, there's a new sick note process, isn't there?
Yeah, there is a new sick note process. So if you are sick due to COVID-19, then you can go online to NHS 11 online, and there you can get I suppose what we call a fit note. You can get one of those, because of course there's the doctors and what have you are not supplying them, so they're doing them online.
Okay. And if you are sick with COVID-19, then you will be entitled to claim statutory sick pay from day one of your symptoms. Normally for SSP, the first 3 days are unpaid, but that is different for this. There is also going to be regs to allow employers to claim back 14 days, small employers, less than 250 employees, but they're not in place yet.
Okay. Quickly, any other benefits?
Basically, if your contract gives you anything else, if your contract gives you contractual sick pay, if your contract gives you another benefit, it's a contractual term and it stays in place.
Right.
If you're
the contract terms kind of carry on regardless.
Yeah, all employment law, the principles of employment law remain in place. I guess it's worth saying that furlough is a brand new concept for employment law as well. It's not something that's ever existed before.
I suspect 99.999% of people had never used the word furlough before.
No.
Never heard of it.
Yeah, there we go. It's no news for us all, isn't it? Okay, but let's say we've got ourselves through that. We've put people on furlough, but maybe we've got to the end of that process either because the scheme's ended, or because we just haven't got the reserves, or we've decided that that the way that we need to operate needs to change so fundamentally when we do come back to work that we've got to take action. Presumably at some point, though, we're going to have a conversation about...
There's the conversation. When the furlough scheme ends, employers must make a decision and taking into account their business situation as to whether the employees return to their duties or not. Staff might not be required anymore to or needed to carry out some of the roles. The businesses may not be able to afford to have the staff back. So unfortunately, there is going to have to be some sort of thought in these situations around consideration of redundancy, basically.
So we've got to keep, I think that comes back to that continuing conversations, but continuing that kind of business planning, cash flow kind of focus
right.
at the same time. Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Just take us the mechanics of it. If we are going to go through a further process, the government's going to make the grant to us. Do we know how that money is going to flow? Do we know how the grant will arrive to us?
Well, I understand that looking at .gov that they're in the process of setting up some sort of portal which employers will be able to put in their details, such as with who the staff are. They also have to do the calculation of what 80% looks like for their staff's salary, NI numbers, that sort of thing, and then the money will be paid into the staff member's bank account. I understand that's how it's going to work,
right.
Unless others know different.
I think we've got some advice that's come in today saying the 20th seems to be the date that that portal
Yeah.
is going to go live.
Yes.
And there seems to be indications that the first set of funding that's going to come through the portal will come through before the end of the month.
Right. Yeah.
Because there's going to be that cash flow issue, having
That's right.
most people that there's going to be furloughing taking place. If the money's not coming through, that's going to be a complete nightmare. I'm going to press on because we'd like to pick up on the other question and answers, but the reimbursement calculation is set out on the .gov website.
Yes.
And there is this £2,500 ceiling, and there's this 80% calculation, and that's going to be even more complicated if we're dealing with people who weren't on fixed hours, or there was some variation in their wages over the time. So that needs a little bit of care to go through. As I've said before, we've got to have that connection with the cash flow for the organisation, how the finances are going to work, and whether we're going to be able to take the risk that we're putting people on furlough and then the claim for the grant funding from the government is not back. That's a risk for the organisation, and we're going to have to keep that in mind as we go through this. We've talked about the furlough letter. You must keep these records, because the HMRC may be able to audit all claims that are made, and they may well audit this process in 5 years' time. So we have got to make sure that we keep our records shipshape in the process. It is a changing field. There's more indication about how this scheme's going to work that's come out this morning. I suspect there'll be more that comes out over the next few months, and there'll be another set that won't come out till the 20th when the portal goes live. And guess what? Will that portal survive the number of applications that's going to hit it on that first day? So let's be prepared for a meltdown on the website, and make sure that we're not relying on cash flow coming through back from the grant scheme for the April pay packet. So we've got to be really careful about that. We'll pull together a few more pointers and signposts for that information, and we'll share that with Clore. So we've got that at least online for people to go back to. But I think, Hilary, that's our whistle stop tour.